My Weirder-est School, Book Number 11. Mrs. Stoker is a Joker. Written by Dan Gutman. Pictures by Jim Pelot. Chapter 4. Bad Jokes and Dad Jokes. We were told there was going to be another assembly so Mrs. Stoker could introduce herself to everyone from kindergarten to 5th grade. So we walked 1,100,000 miles to the all-purpose room again. This time, I got to sit next to Ryan. Mrs. Stoker was up on the stage waving to everybody as we came in. "Hey," she said after all the classes were seated. "How is everybody feeling today? Anybody here from out of town?" "I live here," some first grader shouted. "Well, it's great to be here," said Mrs. Stoker. "Here is way better than there. I'm so excited to be your new principal. I was telling some of the students out on the playground that I was a bad student as a child. Really bad." "How bad were you?" somebody yelled. "I was so bad," said Mrs. Stoker, "that on the first day of 9th grade I brought a ladder with me." "Why?" somebody yelled. "Well, they told me it was high school," said Mrs. Stoker. "Get it? Ladder, high school?" A few kids laughed. "When I was a kid, I used to eat my homework for dessert," continued Mrs. Stoker. "Well, it wasn't my fault. My teacher said our homework was a piece of cake. Ha ha. In my school days, they made us take our tests in the jungle. You know why? Because there were too many cheetahs. Get it?" Mrs. Stoker doubled over laughing at her own jokes. I made sure to laugh, even though they weren't that funny. You should always laugh at the principal's jokes, even if they're not funny. That's the first rule of being a kid. She went on. "There are so many different kinds of schools, am I right? Surfers go to boarding school. People who sell ice cream go to Sunday school." Boy, she sure knows a lot of jokes. "Do you know what a witch's favorite school subject is?" continued Mrs. Stoker. "Spelling. Get it? But seriously, did you ever notice that math books seem so sad? Well, they do have a lot of problems." And she went on. "Do you know what the king of all school supplies is?" "What?" we shouted. "The ruler," said Mrs. Stoker. "Get it? Hey, what's the difference between a teacher and a train?" "What?" we all shouted. "A teacher tells you to spit out your gum, but a train goes choo-choo." Mrs. Stoker doubled over laughing at her own joke again. "She is hilarious," Ryan said to me. "She's going to be a great principal," I agreed. Everybody gave Mrs. Stoker a round of applause. "Well, that's my time, kids," she said. "I'll be here until June. You've been a wonderful lottie." Mrs. Stoker didn't have the chance to finish her sentence because our vice principal, Mrs. Jaffe, stood up and raised her hand. "May I ask a question?" she asked. "Certainly," said Mrs. Stoker. "Ask away." "What qualifies you to be a principal?" asked Mrs. Jaffe. "Ooh," everybody oohed. "How hard could it be?" Mrs. Stoker replied. "All the principal needs to do is yell at kids and decide whether to have recess inside or outside. I can handle that." Mrs. Jaffe didn't look happy with that answer. "Excuse me," she said. "Where did you go to college, Mrs. Stoker?" "I went to the American Comedy Institute," she replied. "I got a BA. That stands for basically amusing." Mrs. Jaffe looked like she was getting madder. "You must have some thoughts about education," she said. "Oh, yes," replied Mrs. Stoker. I'm in favor of it. Our science teacher, Mr. Stoker, put his hand up. At elementary school, he said, we're very serious about recycling the environment and protecting animals. Mrs. Stoker, where do you stand on endangered species? Well, if they're endangered, she said, I wouldn't stand on them. Then she doubled over, laughing again. Hey, that's a good one. I think I'll put it in my act. Some of the teachers looked angry, but Mrs. Stoker didn't seem to notice. Oh, before I go, she said, I have some good news. We will only have half a day of school tomorrow morning. Yay! We all shouted. And we'll have the other half tomorrow afternoon, she continued. Boo! We all shouted, even though I think she was just joking. Mrs. Stoker said we could go back to our classrooms. As we pringled up and filed out of the all-purpose room, we passed by Dr. Carbles in the back. He was talking on his cell phone. Yes, he said excitedly. Mrs. Stoker is even worse than I thought she would be. The teachers already hate her. All she does is tell dumb jokes. She makes Klutz look like Principal of the Year. This is going to be great. Soon I'll be able to shut this place down and achieve my lifelong dream, turning elementary school into a toxic waste dump. Bwahaha.